Tonight, we will hear about Admiral Giorgione's book, Inside Camp David, The Private World of the Presidential Retreat, which combines the fascinating history of the camp with interviews with other camp commanders, first-person anecdotes of the first families, as well as reflections of relocating his own family from California to Maryland for his tour of service. We hosted Admiral Giorgione at the Ford Library in 2018, and he's absolutely thrilled to be coming with us here tonight in Grand Rapids. Please help me in welcoming Admiral Giorgione to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you, Joel. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, folks, for being here. It's a great honor. My first time to Grand Rapids, so I arrived yesterday, went out exploring this area last night. Had a wonderful day today at the museum. I'd like to thank Paul and Tatiana Westfall for a very enjoyable dinner tonight. Thank you for bringing the program here and preserving this piece of American history. Also like to thank Donald Holloway, the curator of the museum, who gave me a great tour today and shared some stories about what we knew about the Fords and their connection to Camp David. And especially I'd like to thank Kristen Mooney. She's up in the control room. She's the public affairs. There she is. Please wave, and please give them all a round of applause. It's been wonderful. You know, much of serving, and I'm sure many of you are veterans, much of serving is about giving thanks for what we have in our nation. And it was a great honor to serve, and that's why I'm honored to come tonight and share a bit about the book and experiences I took away from serving at Camp David during my Navy career. So again, thank you to the President Gerald of Ford Museum for the opportunity. Before I start, I'm going to introduce two people who I know can answer this question in the affirmative, but has anyone been to Camp David in the room? Yes, two people in the back. I'll get to you two. Yes. Would you mind just shouting out what took you to Camp David? The people I'm going to introduce. Okay. So you're related or just really good friends? Okay. Hi, sister and mom. Okay. Thank you. So the people I'm going to introduce, they're referring to are Joe and Susie Camp. Would you please stand up? So please welcome them. Now, Joe's wearing a really cool shirt. It's the Camp David casual shirt, we call it, that says Presidential Retreat, and that's what we wear during visits at Camp David for the military crew. Joe and Susie lived, they're part of this story, and part of their stories and photos are in this book. Joe was the camp commander as well during a time with President George H.W. Bush, and his name almost lends itself, Joe Camp. Joe Camp was the Camp David commander. It's like Joe Camp David. It's like a country music name, but wonderful to have them there, and it's to honor all of the commanding officers and the crew that have served there, and most of them have participated in the writing of this book, sharing their stories. So thank you. And with that, we'll get started. In Navy Command, when you take over, and Camp David is a Navy command, I will explain that in a little bit, this is Change of Command Day. And on this day in June of 1999, my wife Michelle and my two daughters, Brianna and Ryan, handed me this journal. I didn't think of doing this, they thought of it. And the inscription says, Dear Daddy, we want you to write stories about Camp David and the President in this journal. Someday our children will be able to read them. We love you, Brianna and Ryan. And so a very insightful thing, because after each visit by the President, typically on a weekend or wherever he visited, as well as the inauguration, and my whole time, I took notes of what happened. Nothing classified, nothing personal, just observations of interactions with the family and the crew. And I put this journal away for over 17 years, until only a few years ago I realized I had an interest in writing something about it, and I realized that many other commanding officers had done the same thing, and I realized I could write the book. And so that's what started the journey that led to the publication in October 2017. So I'm going to cover a bit about the history of Camp David, how our presidents used Camp David over the past 78 years of history, and also share several moments from my time with President Clinton and President George W. Bush. The history, you're looking into the camp. This is in Catoctin, Mountain Park, which is in Thurmont, Maryland, right off of US 15 between Frederick, Maryland, and Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. So it's in that part of Maryland. And the way it started was the presidents had yachts. There's been several, the Williamsburg, the Sequoia, and this one is a picture of President Roosevelt on the USS Potomac, which today is a museum in San Francisco Bay. But it's called the Floating White House because the president liked to get out of the White House, especially in the summer months, and get aboard, go to sea a bit, if you will, in the Chesapeake Bay and the Potomac, and do his business and recreate. But it was 1942 and not a safe time maybe to be out in the territorial waters. The staff said, Mr. President, we really need to find somewhere else to go. He said, well, find me someplace close to Washington that we can get to easily, by car then, no helicopters yet, and is inexpensive. And coincidentally, they found these cabins up in the Catoctin Mountain recreational area that were built during the time of the New Deal, our recovery from the Depression, that were part of the Work Progress Administration, that were part of the Civilian Conservation Corps, and they found these cabins built in the late 30s, early 40s. And they gave the president three choices. He went to this one and said, this is it. This is my Shangri-La. That, it's a Jeopardy question, is the original name of Camp David, Shangri-La. Where's Shangri-La come from? Anyone? The Lost Horizon. Roosevelt had a bit of a whimsical, interesting sense of humor in nature, and he called it Shangri-La because it was meant to be a mysterious place that was exclusive and kind of unknown. And that's exactly what it was for many years. But today we know it as Camp David. That name was changed at the beginning of President Eisenhower's administration and named after his grandson, David Eisenhower, then 12 in this photo. So from Shangri-La to Camp David, and the name has remained there, of course, since. This is Aspen. Roosevelt lived in the piece on the right, most. He called it the Bear's Den. Again, he had euphemistic names, the Bear's Den. Eisenhower didn't like all these whimsical names for a few of the cabins, and so he renamed the cabin Aspen. Every cabin virtually at Camp David is named after a tree, and he chose the tree Aspen because that's the state tree of Colorado where his wife, Mamie Eisenhower, is from. So a bit of historical connection, too. So this is Aspen. This is where every president has lived in from Roosevelt to current times. Different states of repair, different dimensions. This is Cedar. This is where the commanding officer lives. This is where Joe and Susie Camp live and their two sons. This is where my wife and I and our two daughters live. You are literally by yourself. This is inside the camp. Around the corner is Aspen, the president, on weekends. So very neat to have that experience, but very lonely with young children at times. So some of the dynamic we talk about in the book is just what's it like to raise a family who's not from the political world, but is caught up in this because of the duty station. And as we used to tell the kids, hey, it's a modest house, it's a cabin, but we have a great yard. Okay, so get over it, okay? Modest house, a great yard. Chapter 6 in the book is called The Lonely Sentry. I like it the best because it's about the loneliness of command. It's about being that Marine on patrol 24/7 around the camp in complete darkness and quiet. It's about the loneliness of a president. Many of you are probably business and community leaders. It's the loneliness of your position at times where you're constantly scrutinized, constantly questioned, second-guessed, but that's what comes with the job. That's the territory. So the Lonely Sentry looks at what's it like to be in that role, but also how do you recharge yourself? How do you get away? And many of us believe that Camp David has served that for 7, 8 years for a president, to get away as best a president can from the stress of the office and the stress of Washington, D.C. Top left, President Roosevelt, again in that sector of Aspen, then called the Bear's Den. That stone hearth fireplace is still there. You can't see it, but there's a wagon wheel chandelier above him that's still there. Harry Truman, top right, didn't care for Camp David. He did winterize it, but he preferred to go to his home in Key West, Florida. Quite a trip, but he only went there 10 times, in his 2 terms. President Roosevelt, I think, began one of the most important things about Camp David, as inviting world leaders there. And this is Roosevelt and Churchill at a creek fishing outside of the camp compound, then called Shangri-La. Drinking bourbon, smoking cigars, fishing, and talking about the war. Pretty critical, important things in life done over very human activity of smoking, drinking, sharing stories, building a relationship. To me and many others, that's the real gem of Camp David, is building relationship with our foreign leaders. President Eisenhower again renamed the Camp David, and with his young Vice President, Richard Nixon. President Obama, reflecting, working. You're always working as a president, I'm sure, but there are down times inside Aspen. You see the picture window behind him. Bottom left, you see President Reagan, same picture window. Bottom right, President Nixon, a very formal Camp David. He almost always wore a coat and tie. Same picture window, same Aspen Lodge. Center left, President Carter on the log next to the fish pond that's outside of Aspen. It's an ornamental fish pond today. Roosevelt had it put in because of a great fear of fire, and so it was really a backup water supply. Today it's ornamental fish. There's always a log there, more for ceremonial and picture reasons, but always a log. Top center, President Bush in his day office in the cabin Laurel during my time. And top right, a Pulitzer Prize winning photograph. Let's look at this a little deeper. Called Serious Steps. It won the 1962 Pulitzer Prize. Paul Vathis was the AP reporter out of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. What two presidents are we looking at? Kennedy and Eisenhower. What do you know? What is this about? Who knows? Before that, missile crisis was 62. This is April of 1961. Bay of Pigs. Kennedy's inaugurated January of 61. Eisenhower administration hands over the plans to invade, liberate Cuba. The CIA, forces, rebels, all that. Hands it to the Kennedy administration. I'm sure there's some classified turnover over this. The invasion is launched in April, and it doesn't go over. That's why it's called a fiasco. So think about that. That was a few days, 5 days prior to this. Kennedy, the new, young, Democratic president, reaches across the aisle, calls his predecessor, retired five-star general, older Republican president, and says, can you come to Camp David and help me figure this out, essentially? And that's what's going on this day. One president asking another for help. Desperate move, humble move, all that I think is in here. You look at this photo and you read the body language of Eisenhower, you get to see the tension in his fingers holding his hat. They're very close. He's listening. It probably looks like Kennedy's talking, and they're talking through this. I find that fascinating, coming together. You would want our world leaders, our own leadership, to do that. I don't believe there's been any other time in the history of Camp David where we've had two presidents from different parties together for any reason. But it happened in 1961. Top left, President Johnson with Ellsworth Bunker, the U.S. ambassador to South Vietnam, discussing Vietnam and what to do. And Johnson, of course, makes his decision not to run again after he took over the presidency with the stress of the war. Top right, President Nixon. You see the fish pond again in the log, right outside Aspen. This with Leonid Brezhnev of the Soviet Union. There's a humorous story in the book about the Blue Lincoln Continental. You can read it if you haven't already. Fascinating, this little incident between these two world leaders. Bottom left, President Carter with Anwar Sadat of Egypt, Menachem Begin of Israel. The first of two presidents who wanted to close, or second really, who thought of closing Camp David, didn't think we needed it. But as he worked with these Middle East leaders to forge a peace, he was convinced by his wife, Rosalind, why don't you bring them to Camp David? It's a little more intimate there, easier to talk, it's more natural. And to most of us, that's what made it famous, the 1978 Camp David Peace Accords. Okay. So fascinating the dynamics that go on between the three of them over about an 11-day period. Something that I got to see many years later in 2000. come to that later. Bottom right, by far, the Reagans used Camp David more than any president during 8 years. He and Nancy Reagan went there almost themselves most of the time, occasionally brought world leaders, Margaret Thatcher twice from Great Britain, this is Prime Minister Nakasone of Japan, but really used it as a personal respite, which is the other big use of Camp David, is a getaway. No press, no lights, no protesters, no planes flying overhead, eerily quiet, if you want it that way. That's Camp David. Presidents, of course, always are able to talk to the world and the nation. President Clinton, many radio addresses. President Bush from his day office. President Reagan did 150 of his Saturday radio addresses from the back porch of Laurel, the main entertainment cabin. President Obama in front of, outside of his cabin as well, addressing the press. Again, no press, no media, unless the president lets them in. So complete, almost complete privacy, if that's what you want. 2012, U.S. was the host of the G8 summit. It was supposed to be in Chicago. Occupy Wall Street was going on, a lot of dissension in the nation, a lot of protesting, concerns about security. So on short notice, the president decided, let's move it to Camp David. So this has been the first time that many world leaders have come to Camp David. And with this money shot of those, now you see 10 people there. Can anyone guess where the 2 additional members are from? There's the G8 nations, and then there's 2 more from the European Union. So that representation is why you have 10 people there. As you know, President Trump is going to host the G7 summit here in June. So the second time that large collection of world leaders will go to Camp David. Fascinating stories about Commander Wendy Halsey was the commanding officer, and how to figure out who gets what cabin, because some are nicer than others. They all have amenities, but some are larger, some are closer to Aspen, so there is a pecking order among all humans, including these. Okay, so it really boils down to an overnight sleepover of 9 other world leaders. Bottom left, President Bush assembling after 9/11. This is called the Council of War photo. Classified for many years, declassified not too long ago. And he's with Vice President Cheney, Colin Powell, Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, deciding how the nation and the world will react to 9/11. So very heavy times, very deep times. This is where Cheney went on the day of 9/11 from the White House. And President Trump has only been to Camp David about 10 times in 4 years. Very low usage. His staff has gone there more. The few times he has gone, he has taken his cabinet. So the commanding officers who've served there have gotten a number of the cabinet officials. But very different usage during his time as well. So that's the serious side, the diplomatic side. What about the family side? What about the getaway? And you see the top 2 photos taken from the Ford archives of the Fords during their tenure using Camp David and enjoying it season round, the grounds and the amenities to offer. Bottom left, it's the little things in diplomacy that matter. President George H.W. Bush, Mikhail Gorbachev, Soviet Union. And you see them holding a plaque with a horseshoe on it. Bushes loved competing in sports. Loved it. Everything was a competition, and they loved horseshoes. And Bush was showing Gorbachev around the grounds of Camp David, and they came to the horseshoe pit. Gorbachev didn't understand it, didn't know what it was. Bush showed him how to throw a horseshoe. Mikhail grabs one, he throws a ringer, first toss. They laugh it off, they move on. One of our U.S. Navy Seabees sees this, grabs the horseshoe, routes a plaque, makes an inscription, and gives it to the president to give to Gorbachev that night at dinner. Little things, little things. This is what you learn about diplomacy watching from the sidelines. It's still a human sport. It's still a human contact. And when we're watching on the sidelines how our presidents engage each other, their families, and other leaders, you realize, yes, it's about human interaction and find those moments that you can have in common. Bottom right, during my time, the Evergreen Chapel Choir, the adult choir, President Clinton standing in the back, loves singing in the choir. So every Saturday night, we'd drop the music off at his cabin, Aspen, and we'd show up Sunday morning, greet the parishioners, and sing in the choir. Okay? Kennedys. Only once did we have an official corral at Camp David. It was for Macaroni, because that is the pony. And their children, John and Caroline. And the commanding officer at that time was Chuck Howe. Chuck Howe was 93 years old. He's still living. He lives in Coronado, California, where I live now. And Chuck was interviewed for the book with his son, Hank, and a very emotional interview and story in the book about the day the president was assassinated. Chuck and his wife, Joanne, lived in Cedars, much smaller than the photo I showed you, with 4 children. The oldest, Hank, was a big brother to John. They would play soldier. And one of the things about human nature is sometimes us adults can have pretenses or not with each other, but children usually see through that. And they just want to play. And there's a story one day where there's a knock at the door at Cedar, and Joanne's in the shower, the mom, yelling at the kids, answer the door, and no one does. And she hears the knock again, so she gets out of the shower and puts her towel on and goes storming out to the door and opens it up, and it's the First Lady. And Mrs. Kennedy says, "I'm sorry, Joanne, can your children come out and play with my kids?" These little poignant moments, and it's one of these times where you realize, most of us who have served there realize, for this brief, fortunate time in your career, you were in the world of the president in a very somewhat sterile environment. You are in the world, but you're not of the world. And you must always remember that. You're in the world, but not of the world. So keep your humility. We're servicemen and women. We serve the President of the United States. We serve the office. We're there to support, protect. You're in the world, but never of the world. Okay? The one holiday the Clintons always went to Camp David for, and they didn't use camp a lot in his first term, more his second term, but the one holiday they always went there for 8 years now was Thanksgiving. So I was fortunate to see this happen twice, kind of be the host. And when you're hosting the first family and they're all their relatives and friends and you have to make all the food, that's a bit of a pucker factor, right? You want to get that right. And it went well. And maybe after 8 years we figured it out. But again, interesting that from the sidelines, really like most of us, any other American family wants to get together, go golfing, watch football, take a nap, eat turkey. It's no different. And so part of the intent of the book, again, is to humanize the presidents. They're still people. They have a big job to do. There's a lot expected of them. They're still people, and they need their downtime as well. President Nixon made a lot of changes to Camp David, put a lot of money into building out Aspen a little bit more, putting in this hourglass-shaped pool that you see in this bottom right photo. President Obama only went 39 times in 8 years, so not, again, very low usage, but let his staff use it more. But one of the times he would always recreate with his buddies, his friends, the children. Michelle Obama famously went there for her spa days with her friends and her workouts. So again, it's however the president wants to use it, but traditionally it's been for 2 things: personal getaway, diplomatic discussions. And then a few more stories about my time. So this is change of command day, top left, going out after 26 months. A very fortunate time to serve 2 presidents, 2 administrations. Our office, Cedar, seasonal shots. You're well familiar with snow, so I don't have to tell you what that is. Southern California doesn't understand what this shot is, so that's Cedar. The other thing I learned about Camp David was how to be perfect but natural. Now, granted, there's no perfection in the world. I don't believe in perfection, but there's a way to have high standards and expectations of your crew. But how do you run a crew at Camp David when you're serving the president? You want everything to be perfect. But how do you do it and make it look natural? So you're not all uptight all the time, and you're not too tough with your crew or too critical. How do you make it look natural? And that's a challenge. So you see this perfect snowfall. It's one of my favorite cabins, Holly. Perfect snowfall, but we haven't cleaned the snow yet. We haven't cleaned the streets. We haven't lit the fire. And little things like where do you put all the snow at Camp David is an issue. And so we know where to put it, but little things like that. And how do you not take the snowplow blade and turf the grass and make a big muddy streak? And how do you fix that up before the president shows up? Or as Nancy Reagan famously complained once, in fall day, looking out across Aspen, She asked, where are all the leaves? Our sailors had done such a good job with the grounds crew that it didn't look natural. Wow. So that night, Seabees went out again and literally sprinkled some leaves. Okay? Perfect, but natural. How do you discipline a crew member who's made a mistake, an honest mistake, but not get too uptight, but not too lax, because it's a high-risk environment? So probably one of the best leadership lessons I took was how to maintain that sense of decorum and balance between perfect but natural. President Clinton winding up 8 years in office, his 6th formal meeting with Ehud Barak, Prime Minister of Israel, Yasser Arafat, Chairman of the PLO, happened at Camp David. One of his main goals and then disappointments in life was a peace treaty with these two. And he brought them together in the summer of 2000. We had about 5 days' notice that they were coming to Camp David, which was plenty, working with the State Department. Typically, when you greet a president, as I am in this shot, you're in your Navy uniform. And the reason why the Navy has Camp David, let's go back to that yacht in President Roosevelt. When he couldn't go out on the yacht, which was manned by Navy sailors, he took the sailors with him to Camp David, then Shangri-La. Then he got some Marines from 8th and I Barracks, the oldest barracks in the Marine Corps out of Washington, D.C., and they became the security guards, and that's what we have today. So that's why it's a Navy activity. We've had it since then. And the Navy Civil Engineer Corps that Joe and I served in, and the Seabees, are who maintain it most of the time. Okay? That's the Navy connection. So I'm welcoming President Clinton to Camp David the day before the summit is to begin. Madeleine Albright, Secretary of State, who I know has visited this museum before, is helping me. Typically, we greet world leaders as well, as I am with Prime Minister Barak. Yasser Arafat did not want any greeting of any sort. He refused to come in any American conveyance, whether it was a limousine, a car, a helicopter, whatever. And it was only by really luck or happenstance I ran into him in this one cabin where the White House photographer is standing there. And you can see I'm wearing the shirt that Joe Camp is wearing. Not the same shirt, but the same style. And easily the most surreal photo I have, shaking Yasser Arafat's hand. It goes on for 2 weeks. President Clinton left to go to the G8 summit in Okinawa that year. He told Madeleine Albright, keep them here, don't let them kill each other. I literally heard him say that. I'll be back. He so wanted to have something come out of it. And if you read his book, My Life, he considers it his greatest disappointment, failure of his presidency, was not forging a peace treaty between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And there's still articles, every day I read articles, or have access to articles about this today, of what was missed. How do you say goodbye to the president? President Clinton, term was up, inauguration or elections were held, and now it's time to say goodbye. For those of you that are still in business or any organization where you have people that work for you, this is the greatest lesson I learned about delegation and trust. I found out that the camp had done some things to say goodbye to President Reagan and George H.W. Bush. I asked the White House East Wing, the White House military office, can we do something to say goodbye to the Clintons? He said, sure, do whatever you want. I wasn't asked for a script. I wasn't asked for what are you going to say that night. They said, do whatever you want. So certainly there's some trust in relationship there, but I will tell you folks, as a 43-year-old commander, I never felt more trusted in my life. When my boss said, we trust you and your crew, go ahead. Now, we all know there's a consequence if you mess up. But so how do you say goodbye? So the final Clinton weekend was 4 days in January of 2001. It was chaos in a good way. A lot of guests, all Democratic guests, of course, saying goodbye, dinners, tours, 2 concerts in the chapel, a lot of activity. And then the final day is Sunday. They're going to be at Camp David. So that Sunday morning, at the end of service, the Protestant service, my wife, Michelle, and Ginger Williams, the chaplain's wife, are giving the Clintons this photo that stood in the vestibule for 8 years. It's of President Clinton talking to some of the military children. You can see him holding his leather song folder, right? Mrs. Clinton is now Senator-elect Clinton. This was the 2000 election, so she's elected Senator of New York. and Chelsea's a student at Stanford University. So that was Sunday morning. Sunday evening, we got together in the hangar. There's Buddy, the dog, first dog. Have a little ceremony. They say a few words. Master Chief and I give a few gifts. The Clintons agree to take a photo with the crew, mostly those not on duty, of course. Military, all services represented in this photo, mostly sailors and Marines. But the White House Communications Agency is there, so you'll see some Army uniforms, maybe Air Force. And then I walk them out to the landing zone to say goodbye. So it's January 2001. It's a Sunday night, about 10 p.m. It's snowy. It's a little cool. And you're saying goodbye to the President and the First Lady for what has been the last time I see them. And you have some of that human banter. Hey, call if you need anything. Got your number, sir. It's pleasantry, and it's just a flash. You don't remember much of it. But as I'm about to walk him down the walkway to the helicopter to go back to the South Lawn, Chelsea turns to me. And she said, Commander, I've had these in my bedroom for 8 years at Aspen. They're 2 stuffed animals. She handed them to me. She says, I want you to give them to your 2 daughters as a thank you. So again, these little poignant moments, personal human moments. You're in their world. You're not of their world. But it's very, very touching. Simple human gestures. And off they go. And that's the last time I've seen them, was January of 2001. Of course, after a very protracted election result campaign, as you know, we know that President Bush is coming in as the 43rd President of the United States. He certainly knows Camp David well from his dad's usage. Very popular usage as well. And what impressed me was the Bush's very first visit. Players to visit. They didn't invite him to the White House, which can be more formal, right? State dinner, a bunch of people, glass, china. That's not really the Bushes. They didn't know the Blairs. Blairs are great friends of the Clintons, left-wing, right-wing difference, but they invited just the couple to Camp David. And this was not a tragic time in our world so much. So there wasn't a lot of staff, no security briefings, anything heavy like that. This was just 2 couples getting to know each other, like when you move into a new neighborhood. And again, watching it from the sidelines, you take away, hey, it's about building relationships. I don't care who you are. The president has to do it too with our allies. You know you're our allies. You still have to build the personal rapport. And so that impressed me. Again, it's important. These little things matter. So it was a lighthearted, humorous weekend, and just, again, being a part of that was a great honor. He did the similar thing in July, same year, when he invited Prime Minister Koizumi of Japan, one of our key allies in the Pacific, to come to Camp David. I knew this was a big deal because of 9/11, but I didn't realize how big a deal it was until I was at the Bush Library this past March. And President Bush doesn't like to talk as much about 9/11, but he alluded to this conversation Prime Minister Koizumi had with him on September 12th, when he called the president, like a lot of other world leaders, and said, America will be with you. But he referenced this visit that day. I had never heard that President Bush said it that night. He remembered the relationship starting this day at Camp David and Koizumi reaching out on September 12th. Bushes loved Camp David like their parents. They visited often, maybe 3 weekends out of 4. Another shot of Evergreen Chapel. Just a great mix of diplomatic usage of world leaders as well as personal getaway for the family. I've mentioned Evergreen Chapel several times. This was built only in 1991 as a gift from a private contractor, raised private money, gifted it to the United States of America. It's the non-denominational chapel at Camp David. It was rededicated, 10-year anniversary during our time there, so both Bushes were there, and they took photos with all the families that attended service that day. So again, just showing great humility and kindness to the crew that serves there and being part of this service 10 years later. And then I ask you, how does the president say goodbye to you? Because my time was up and it was time to go away. And so one nice thing is he invites you to his house, the White House, to say goodbye. And that's what he did this day in August of 2001, showing Michelle and the girls and I around the Rose Garden, telling a few stories, writing the girls a few notes. And that was our last official photo while in that job with the president. Now, I mentioned being at his library last March when he had a specific exhibit for Camp David. We had seen him twice while he was still president, but we were invited back to be on a roundtable discussion to dedicate his exhibit. And 20 years of age, there you have it. I think the girls are still looking good. What do you think, right? So, if you ever get to visit Camp David, I'm sure our guests here have done this, of course, we'll take your photo at the iconic Camp David sign. That's the one souvenir, the only photograph you'll probably get, and we take it for you, is this. And it's been an honor to share some of these stories with you. It began about 21 years ago with this simple journal and inscription from our daughters at the time, 7 and 4. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your attention, and I will take any questions or comments you might have. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to combine those two. I did get to meet 4 presidents. I'll give you a memory of President George H.W. Bush, who I didn't serve, but I got to have brunch with him one day after that chapel. When I was in the Pentagon as a naval officer, there was a painting, an oil painting of the rescue of Lieutenant J.G. Bush. You know, he was shot down in the war and rescued by the USS Trinidad. And this is well before I knew I was going to Camp David. I see this oil painting every day. And then one day at brunch, I'm sitting next to him. And Barbara's there, my wife's here. Well, I'm going for it. I asked him, sir, and he tells a story, which I'm sure he's told many times, of being shot down, losing his 2 crewmen, gets a little teary-eyed, talks about his rescue, his thanks. So that moment is really special. George H.W. Bush telling me about his rescue of Lieutenant J.G. President Clinton, very gregarious, loved coming to camp, again, used it more second term, loved bringing lots of friends. So he was exciting to be around, lots of energy, lots of engagement with the crew. The Bushes knew it well as well. Probably had a stronger relationship because they knew the military culture better. And brought with him a lot more common visits. So it was very interesting to watch him as well. So those were snippets of things I really enjoyed and took away from each of them. Sir? Every COI probably has had one time they thought they were going to lose their job. And John Detbarn is the CO, was in Carlsbad, California. He was there during the Nixon years. His dog attacked a Nixon poodle and tore it up pretty bad one day. It's in the book. He goes to the medical clinic, and the president's physician is stitching up the poodle, which belonged to one of the girls. And John thought for sure he was going to get fired. The Filipino steward that served Nixon for many years during his presidency and afterwards told him, he went to apologize and asked him, he said, don't worry, come back tomorrow. Apparently Nixon didn't really care for the dog, so but apparently when a gray poodle stitches, when the hair grows back in, it's black. So every time he saw this poodle, it had black markings. Middle East Peace Summit, we're in Cedar, across the street is Rosebud, a guest cabin. There were 4 Palestinians in there. Guests. Yasser Arafat delegation. And the cabins have fire alarm systems, and our crew is trained to fight fires, helicopter and structural. And one July night, the fire alarm goes off. And what does your well-trained Camp David crew do? They show up with fire trucks, sirens, and Marines with weapons. Because you don't know. My CDO gets there first, our CDO, and she relays a story later to me. She goes in there, and the Palestinian guests are very nervous. They're shoving things in the fireplace that's burning. That's why the fire alarm goes off. They're flushing things down the toilets. They don't know what's going on. And so you can imagine if this gets out, Palestinians under attack at Camp David. It was a trap all along, as Yasser Arafat thought. And so there was just this moment of getting in there and calming it down. And the the handlers, some of the delegation, to help calm it down as well. And so that was my almost got fired moment. Okay? I'm sure Joe can't probably answer like 2 or 3. Yeah. Not so much, although there's a few exceptions. So the officers tend to go 2 to 3 years. Our enlisted crew can go 3 to 5 years. The Marines generally 2 years and out because they're their first school out of the security forces. We've had some military members who spent a long time there and now civilian staff there. We now have a federal fire chief for the fire department. That's somewhat of a permanent billet. But very few civilian billets. It's really all military, all Navy folks. Mostly about 200 of us rotating every 3 to 5. Yes, sir. Yeah, my consolation prize were orders to Hawaii. Which I'm thankful for because I got away from D.C. Because you're in the loop, you kind of feel like you're part of the news, and you aren't, but you are. And I went to this other location and right into public works management. Right back into the bread and butter, what you do as an engineer, kind of a city engineer, if you will, for the base. Yes, ma'am. Sure. They've had, you can almost walk up to it or drive down the access lane unknowingly, and we'll stop you and question you. I'm sure some have tried to get it. There was a story, was it during Mike Berry's time, the woman crashing into the gate? Yeah, another CO around Joe's time who ran into the gate. And so, but rarely, nothing's happened from it, but I'm sure some people try to get close. Again, it's in a national park. You kind of know where it is, but people respect the boundaries, and we have ways of keeping you away. Any other questions? Yes? We can put you as a guest about 15 cabins. I think it'd be very small, 1 bed to a suite, if you will. We have barracks. That's where the single sailors and Marines live. If you're a staffer, like a Secret Service or extra with the delegations, you'll be in the barracks, or you'll be out in the hotel in Thermont or Frederick, Maryland. But the guest cabins for the president, that's why I mentioned that sleepover. There are nicer cabins closer to Aspen, and the rest can be a little tighter. They're all pleasant, but very rustic, single story, oak plank siding, cedar shake shingle, nothing fancy, no brass, no marble, no valet service. Yes, ma'am. My kids were in one church school, preschool, and the older daughter went to public school and then a magnet school in Frederick. Joe, your boys? Thermont Public Schools? Yeah. So the kids would catch a bus at the end of the access lane, get to drive them out in the golf cart. All season, public school bus would pick them up in the park and take them back in. Yes, sir.
How do you assure moving more leaders with their cabins aren't fucked? We use bugs or something. Just see what you learn about how we move our president around the world. Our president does not go anywhere without us.
Secret Service and weapons. When our president travels, and you get beat up, every president gets beat up in the press. When we travel overseas, we take the sedans and the helicopters with us. We have the advance, we have the communications, we have food security. That's not the way it is for every other world. I'm glad they trust us, but it's different the way we protect our commander-in-chief. We put a lot of money, a lot of effort in that. 2,200 civilians and military behind the president. That's the East Wing, the White House military office. Those protocols, we don't let anyone else bring weapons in. We presume they don't have bugging devices. We don't know. Susan.
So Brianna and Brianne are part of a small exclusive group of Camp David kids. Have you ever talked to them about what their favorite memories are of being at Camp David? I was asked that question once and I couldn't answer, so I went right home and called my boys and said, tell me something to write now.
So the Cedar kids is what Susie's talking about, the kids who spent part of their young life in the cabin Cedar. Ryan, my youngest, remembers writing President Bush a note after 9/11. Now, we were in Hawaii, but he answered her. Brianna remembers singing in the choir at times and looking at the president front row. Ryan would sing, but not really pay attention, but she would wink at George Bush, and he would wink back. And that's how he was with her today when we saw him last year. So that whimsical connection was the strongest. They were in awe of Chelsea, but Chelsea wasn't there a lot. They didn't really have much interaction, but they were touched by the stuff. So that's what they remember. Okay.
When you talk about those castles, is that, who's there? Is it the military people,
We open up to the families, military families, and since 9/11, things are just a little harder with security. So our members, our families can come to camp anytime, but there's a protocol to get to the gate and ID check. And I was there at a time when cell phones didn't exist, so you can't bring a cell phone in. Or if you're part of that crew that has it, you have to. Every other guest, you and I today would have to check it at the front gate. We try to control the photography. I'm thankful and impressed that no president's guest has really put anything out in public domain because we don't take their cell phones. But it's part of the protocol. Yes, sir.
You were there with Aerofax, is that right?
Yes.
What was your take about your retreat camp? And also, around relationship like
It was tense, and kind of like Sadat and Begin back in '78. They didn't read a lot. I think they had at least one dinner where they toasted each other.
Again, you're dealing with cultures that don't drink alcohol, so we took all the alcohol out of the cabins. We had prayer rugs and a tour. You try to make it seem like everyone's treated the same. That was the stress on us, was to make it seem that way. I only saw Arafat that one time, and maybe when he left. He usually stayed in his cabin. Did not come out much. Ehud Brock, that was the second time he'd been to Camp David. I met him earlier, so a little more open, a little more congenial, if you will. But again, heavy negotiations going on, so not a lot of interaction. Typically, you see the president 3 times: arrival, departure, and chapel. You may not see him at any other time other than that. You should kind of stay out of the way. Okay, yes, ma'am. We have our medical cabins called eucalyptus. Pretty clever, right? Ash is the fire station, not so clever. So we have our staff with all independent duty corpsmen. Certainly, the president always travels with his nurse and military nurse and doctor. And then throughout the world, we know where the trauma centers are and where we would take an elected official if needed. So we know that about where to evacuate if necessary. But pretty much that immediate staff always is with us. Yes, sir.
I would never leave camp. So the XO, John Cornell, was my time still on the golf office. And Clinton loved the golf. So he went out all the time. Bush didn't. He was more into running and then mountain biking. So
President Clinton was probably allegedly is a pretty good golfer, but I never witnessed it. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
As in your personal life, your wife was cooking, she was doing the grocery shopping, was that pretty much everything was normal in your life?
nothing. One of the best stories in the book about the goldfish. Right? We read that. So the wife and daughter go to the Fairmont Fair, they get a little goldfish, they're coming back to the gate. This is our Marines, our rules. But no pets at the time. See it,
No pets in Camp David, even though there's wild animals. And we had deer and squirrels and all. And the kids are in the back seat, and the Marines are telling the story. Or the Marines say, "I'm sorry, ma'am, my wife, no pets." She said, "Well, they're goldfish, ma'am. You know the rules is no pets." So the girls are like starting to cry. And my wife goes, "Well, it's dinner." We did not eat the goldfish, okay? It's, again, our rules, those little things when you're living alone, you're the CO and you have a normal life, it's trying to make it normal. I was a little uptight about snow. I didn't want the kids making a snow camp. I'm sure the president wouldn't care. In fact, they'd probably appreciate it, but perfect and natural. So you look back, you laugh about it, but then when you're in the seat, you know, you act different. You want to make it look natural, somewhat true. So we do it twice a day. So that's why I say it's not quite normal.
Does the staff eat and cook their own meals, or does the people that come to visit, do they cook their own meals, or does the chef, everybody eat in a set room?
So we have a galley that serves our military crew. If the president or guests wanted to eat in the galley, they could. Most presidents have a chef they're personal about, and so I know with Clinton and Bush, the chef of the Bushes from the mansion in Texas came with them for the first year, but then he taught our staff, our mess cooks, back then we called them, to cook. And so our men and women knew how to cook for the president. Some will like to prepare their own meal. Barbara Bush did that one Christmas. She sent the staff home and said, you go home with your families, I can make meals. And so a little bit of everything. But generally we provide the meals. The first family decides what they want to eat. We prepare the food. And even though this is a Navy activity, important for money, all the food and drink consumed by a president's guests is paid for by the president. Those bills are kept separate. Okay? Public money, our taxes maintain the camp for the purpose of the commander-in-chief and the president. Operation maintenance. Personal guests, gifts, food, drink, that's all paid for by the president. Okay?
You just brought up money. Can you speak to your yearly budget?
No. You can look this up, congressional background. During my time, it was 3.4.
Yes, ma'am.
In all the years of hearing about Camp David, I'm a little bit shocked. I love it, it's great. But I'm wondering, what was the discipline of foreign visitors coming to Camp David? Did they know a little bit about what it would be like rather than something, marble and gold and silver and
I'm sure some had that image before they went for the first time. Khrushchev kind of formed the term the spirit of Camp David. Khrushchev.
really?
Soviet Union from here, but he kind of got the sense of the calm.
The surreal nature of it. So that Camp David mystique, I think, is carried on. Why I think it's a great compliment, would be to a world leader to bring them there.
I love it. I'm really, really impressed. I'm so happy that you're Christian as well.
Oh, thank you.
So easy to see. What's Camp David like?
You know, the best reviews are the worst reviews, which weren't many, of the book because people were looking for dirt. They were looking for trash. And that's not in the book. That would be a disrespect to our presidents, it would be a disrespect to all of us who live there, all the Marines and sailors who have served there. And so it's not that kind of book. It's not that inside, nor whatever. It's about the history. It's about how they've used it for diplomacy and a personal getaway. Those are the stories I think are important.
One more.
So, in the same line, then, there is no large, like, gymnasium or hotel or anything like that? The cabins and the functioning buildings that operate?
We have the functional buildings, but we have a nice gym, we have a pool, several pools actually. We have a basketball court. In fact, it's the only basketball court in the world, with the presidential seal in the center. Which President Obama loved playing. That seal was built during Bush's time. It was used more during the Obama time. He loved that basketball court. We have a skeet range, a golf range, all those things around the hangar area. Cross-country trails, ski trails for cross-country skiing. I knew as a commander I was going to be considered. Some people do ask for it. Did you ask for it, Joe? No. Most people wouldn't ask for that, but you kind of know you're in the zone. Once the Navy gives the names of the White House, it's up to them. So we go through a bit of a background check, initial interviews, you visit for a day, they check your teeth, your hair. And it's very fortunate. You can never forget that. You were very fortunate. Okay, our time is up. Joel, thank you, everyone. Thank you.
as well as our book here about the previous collection in the museum here at the Fort. So this is kind of our, this bookcase contains, if you haven't seen this book contains the previous collection.